First, I would like to welcome you all and thank everyone for coming, especially it's a short notice for this event. I know that you're all very busy and it's difficult to take time away from work, and I really appreciate for being here. I'm the project coordinator for Adorable Academy, which is financed by Vizanskiy's consortium for design enabled innovation in urban environment. And here are my colleagues, Maxim Leskov, Milena Miteva, Javor Panes, and Sveta Yotsova. And I would like to take a moment to introduce our lecturer, Saskia Van Stейн. She's independent curator, moderator, and based in the Netherlands. And she's also part of the team of the Dutch Venice Biennale entry in 2010 with Raf, Jürgen Wey, Joost Hotens, and Barbara Fischer. So today, Saskia will share her lessons from Vacant NL, where architecture meets ideas.
Thank you so much for this lovely introduction. Indeed, Saskia Van Steyne, curator, moderator and educator. I currently have the position as head at the Design Academy. So I operate a little bit between the scales of architecture, cultural production and design, and have recently stopped my tenure at Bureau Europa. And before that, I was curator for the Netherlands Architecture Institute. And it is within this capacity as a curator for the Netherlands Architecture Institute that I was part of this marvelous team that I'll introduce in a moment. I want to introduce, or I want to thank Charles Esche, director of the Van Abbe Museum, for introducing me to give this modest talk. I'll be speaking for about half an hour, and then there will be opportunities to have a Q&A, but maybe we could do a second Q&A if the film is actually live, and then people would still have questions. I'm open to have a second meeting with all of you. I'll try to speak a bit slow so everybody can jump on board, and if you feel that you have questions and don't dare post them in English, then Nevena has offered to translate them for you. That said, I have prepared 3 parts of a presentation looking back at 2010, Vacant NL, the context, the content. I have come with some propositions on how to understand and how to make architecture productive again that we consider monuments or our heritage, and then some more challenging questions on which design attitude we need to address these questions. So without further ado, I will jump in. I will speak for about half an hour on invitation. These are the people that made everything possible, always important to mention. So again, thank you very much for the invitation. The context of the biennial will be sketched in a minute, but the context from which I speak is obviously the Dutch context. So it could very well be that some of these conditions are very different in the Bulgarian reality of life. But what we try to do today is maybe look at some systems, some way of thinking that could make all of this productive. But now I will take you back to 2010. And in 2010, the agenda of the Netherlands Architecture Institute was giving form to an architecture that was societally driven, an architecture that was not so much looking at the market, but looking at a role and responsibility to play. When we talk about looking at the logos surrounding the architecture of consequence title, we see, for instance, a euro sign, how to define ways of how we make money, alternative monetary systems, how will we feed the world, which energy models will fit our future, how can we think about communities in a fragmented world. So these were the questions that then Director Ole Bouwman put forward for us to respond on. And the context was, of course, that of the aftermath crisis, the global financial crisis, at least in the Western developed world, suffering from the Lehman Brothers crisis. In the Dutch context, that meant that there was a lot of vacancy. Vacancy literally in the built environment. So the built environment being shops, so retail, old industrial buildings, churches, and in particular office buildings. So this gives an insight in how at the time when we started the exhibition, it was about around 15% vacancy rate. Now, a good vacancy rate for an economy is about 4 to 6%. So people can find new homes and there is a certain dynamic and mobility in a city. So it says a lot about a country when it's 15%. And we actually made it up to 20%. So 1/5 back then was empty. Simultaneously, the Dutch government had decided to invest in the creative industry as one of their policy, let's say, spearing points in the creative industry. So it is where the government put all their trust when it came to, in fact, what could catalyze the new economy. I'll get back to the new economy by the end of my short talk. Also, the projections were that in the Dutch context, we would have a rise in population where there was, in fact, a stagnation and even a slight decline. So then the third aspect was populism was rising. So you have one party saying Holland is full, but in fact it's full of empty buildings, obviously. Making a caricature of our own country, you see on the left, as if it's colored Moroccan. And just to give you an insight, the migrants, most of the migrants we had were initially here to work in the mines in the south of the Netherlands. And then after the Second World War, the migrants were here to help build first our cities and then our economy. And in the current condition, back then in 2010, this populism was rising. So these were, let's say, the societal pressures and the institutional context from which the curatorial team that you have already mentioned, under supervision of Raaf, came up with this idea of Vacant NL and connecting this vacancy with a certain potentiality. To frame a little bit where this happens, I'm not sure if everybody knows about the biennial, so a very brief introduction into end of the 19th century. We had all these ideas of the beginning of the World Fair. This was, of course, the world was growing. The beginning of globalization is probably in the 14th century, but this, when it really became one world, is through the lens of that we started presenting ourselves as nation states to each other. This happened in, as I mentioned, world fairs, where you had innovation, industry, and an audience coming together, but also through the lens of culture. And here you see a very old map of the initial Giardini in Venice, where the biennial is hosted. Now that biennial is becoming more and more a cultural spectacle in itself. I just couldn't find the accurate figures of the biennial in 2010, but this give you a good idea. So in a period of 3 months, you have about 250,000 people running through the Giardini, by now also the whole island, in order to get, let's say, a cultural impulse and get to a certain extent an insight what's happening in different contexts. In our reality, after the Second World War, the Dutch were one of the first, the Belgians were the first to be the pavilion, to build a pavilion, and then Rietveld was asked to build a pavilion on behalf of the Dutch Ministry of Culture, Sports and Education, and he designed this marvelous modernist, but let's say simple but not simplistic structure obviously inspired on the style. So there were two lines of thought at that period, more, let's say, the traditionalists and then the modernists, and he got the assignment. And that resulted in the Dutch pavilion. Now, the combination of these two, the building being finished in 1953 and it being programmed every other year for architecture and the other year for art, but it's only being programmed, in fact, for 3 months a year. So you could say that the building itself was a, let's say, a ghost, or not so much maybe a ghost, but a metaphor or a protagonist of the story that we wanted to introduce. Because for those of you who do not know, the Giardini basically closes off, or everybody leaves, the whole circus leaves, and then it becomes a place where a lot of stray dogs live, and every now and then you see somebody sitting there to relax, but that's about it. I found these marvelous drawings while doing research for this talk on the archive of the New Institute, and I found it so remarkable that somehow these sketches are from '53, but the photograph we used for the invitation nearly is the same. So we also start to think about time. What does time mean, going back and forth? I think this is another element of our time, that we're revisiting time. What does it mean when everything is in constant acceleration? One of these terms, obviously, is the non-linear. What can we learn from maybe the 17th century to not make mistakes in our near future? But as said, this building has been empty for more than 39 years. A provocation, an emptiness, to explain a little bit where that came from. This is what we ended up doing. The investigation led us to understand that there were some 7,000 monuments, Dutch heritage. So what we call a monument, there's there's multiple categories, but roughly taken, the young monuments, those two are 50 years, and the older monuments, they're, let's say, more than 80 to 100 years old, are maintained and cared for by the Dutch government. And this maintenance is, of course, literally taking care of the building, restoring it, having security and shelter, and that's to a certain extent what it is. The legislation is very tight on these buildings, and they don't allow for a lot of adaptation, but they just stand there as a residue of a time that has been. And I just want to point out that all these nearly 7,000 models are floating above your head when you come into the Rietveld Pavilion. A beautiful, serene, calm presentation, as I mentioned, also bearing in mind what is the expectation of an audience. What can you give them in the short amount of time, running around, wanting to see everything? I want to point out, you nearly don't see it, but at the heart of this image here, you see the marvelous graphic design by Studio Joost Grotens, where he, in fact, only played with lightness even more, creating white letters. And this was, of course, a very seductive image to maybe reference a little bit the Nolly map. For those of you who do not know the map, this 18th century attempt to not draw in the buildings, but draw in public domain. So what makes a building public, or what is the surrounding of a building? Of course, it also references the office ceilings, usually a bit lower, so that they can hide all the technical necessities. Because I know it's for architects, I want to share the fact that the pulling power of the installation itself was so great that we couldn't connect it to the pavilion because the pavilion's walls are too thin. We would pull the pavilion in two. So this is, if you look at, this is the solution to create the tension there. So this is what it looked like once you went up the stairs on the side cases, an overview of reminiscence of which kind of architecture do we see? So we see an industry, the way we work and the way we produce has changed to one extent because of the outsourcing to low wages countries, to another extent, literally because the way we work has changed. I mean, we're also looking at this at a laptop. I don't have to tell you how our work has changed. We see churches, particularly in the Dutch context, I always struggle with this word, but people have lost their faith. So the de-religization has as a residue that a lot of churches are in fact empty. So there are some icons, but some also utilitarian buildings that gave this marvelous overview of these buildings. Now, zooming in, gets a good insight. Then the second aspect of this installation was the Dutch Atlas of Vacancy, also produced by Studio Roos Grotens with data that Raaf provided. And in this atlas, a proposition was made. Here you see the black dots, again the Netherlands, the black dots hinting on all the vacant property. Where is it? We see a centralization. This is Amsterdam, this is Rotterdam, where I am seated at the moment. But it actually gives you an idea where these locations are. Then zooming into the inner city, where are they located more specifically? And in this atlas, there was a proposition, literally trying to look at it as an architectural dissecting of the body as a building, or the building as a body, in order to understand what can we do with these buildings. You can tell there's not a soul in these pictures. An iconic system was devised as a provocation to show what you could do. So one building could, for instance, be very suitable for making a lot of noise. Other buildings are better for making kilns to make ceramics. So we did a lot of, so for instance, the lamp is innovation. A little, let's say, a provocation on how to use this. Then looking to the right side, artist Barbara Visser introduced her placebook Panorama, where she connected buildings with networks. And with networks, I literally mean who knows who, how are the relation forms, who taught who. I think we are a fairly small country, so there's all these relations coming through, and usually they were grounded in cheap temporal spaces that people could in fact use to start their career, to start their networks, and to solidify their practice as architects or designers. Last point I wanted to illustrate is a little booklet that we made as a giveaway, where people could find the inspiration through projects that made this architecture productive, again, as a potentiality. In the booklets, there was this marvelous drawing of all the models that you just saw. That also says a lot. So everything was extruded and then glued together for the technical insight on how the things were made. So they have a certain third dimension, but it is actually the second and connected with the third. In this modest booklet, we also had 10 propositions, ideas on how to deal with this vacancy. Now these are, we'll get onto the role of the architect or the civic actor maybe a bit later on, but two older projects, both rooted in the 90s. We started off with them. They're both based in Amsterdam, but are now a thriving heart of the cultural life again. And it's all only because, in this case, these two ladies understood the potential of these spaces and started activating them through parties, through getting the politicians on board, and so on and so forth. But also, this is a project on the left by Esther van der Wiel, where she and in a whole neighborhood worked on urban farming. Again, please place it in 2010. By now, everybody's urban farming, but it was, these people were pioneering when it comes to this kind of strategies operating in the periphery, but I think the periphery has moved towards them. This project did get a lot of media attention, both in a national as well as an international review. So this is very inspiring to see how something that is visually seductive can actually have a lot of audience resonate with it. And that's a good entry point probably for an exhibition, because then things start to move, and that's ultimately what you want, so that we can have a conversation about our built environment. And the way it also moved was towards education. So there was a temporal master dealing with vacancy given at Rietveld, of course by Raaf. And then they also produced a book which contained the most crucial information points on what to bear in mind when dealing with these questions. So the project was very successful in the sense that it really came at the right place at the right time, and in fact also I think was fueling that year's conversation of our king, because he said we are a due democracy. Now of course this is a joke. He did say we're a due democracy, but it is the question if we influenced him with Vacant NL. Because what was, of course, the bottom line of the contribution is to activate these spaces, to activate all actors, the architect, the politician, and preferably also all the civilians. When our king mentioned we are due democracy, there was a lot of cynicism in the Netherlands, because it was also the period where there were a lot of budget cuts in cultural life, and in how everything was funded. So the question was posed, is it just another way to push through austerity measurements, or do we truly want to emancipate and give civic agency to our fellow human beings? This was also the time, let's say, where in literature, in the architectural literature, a lot of agency was being put back into the discipline. I'm talking about, again, mainly the Dutch context. So in the aftermath of the Super Dutch generation, there was an investigation going on how the architect could place him or herself or themselves in the center of a societal challenge again. Which attitude is needed, and how do you organize a practice around that? I want to show several architecture practices that do that. And since this is all about heritage and how to activate heritage, I've limited it myself to strategies that deal with heritage, but there are many strategies going on at the same time. And to illustrate it a little bit is that we could say that the architecture discipline has been expanded. So it's not so much architecture for its form or composition or shape. It is about a way of thinking that I'll try to illustrate through these projects. And by way of thinking, I mean a strategic and a programmatic approach to certain societal challenges that we have. And two things are very important in that is time. Time is commitment. How long can you commit to a particular project? And the second important thing is scale. How can you scale up small ideas? So I made this little matrix. I think I'm sort of in front of half of it, but it doesn't really matter. To explain how I organized it, this is the event space. And this is then the longue durée, by which I mean, and this is, I consider, a year. So an event is anything from a day to 2 weeks, a year, and then when it becomes rooted into the urban fabric. Then there's the idea of the interior. What can we do to activate interiors versus how does it land on a larger scale in a city or even in a region? So the first that I will start with is a project by Zus. It's an older project, but I think for me, the first group of, let's say, beside everything that happened in the 70s, because we can make long lines in this way of thinking back to the previous century. But zus, Zon Ruben Sensible, chose to develop this project in the front. Initially, this building, they are now talking about this whole region, but initially this building, Schieblok, in 2008, they were squatting that building, and it was going to be demolished in order for it to become a parking lot. And then they spoke to the owner to see if they could in fact use the capital that was projected onto the parking lot to accumulate that and use that money to give the whole building a second life. This is what we would call, in terms of heritage, a young monument, because it's of course in this late modernist, early international style. It is at the entrance of the city of Rotterdam in the north side. You can see the train and the highway coming in here. And how they organized it, after showing you the before and after photograph, of course, on top is the before. We know these settings from multiple locations, but a very grim, closed-off plinth, not alive at all, which has now become to life. And what they very cleverly did was combine public program with private initiative, and the shift between, let's say, ownership versus usership is a very important one. So how do we think about space? There are many things that they initiated and structurally rethought. Anything from the office space, but also in how to produce food. We all know the figures. The earth is growing. Distribution of food is becoming more and more a problem on a global level. Some regions are fine, but that said, the roof guerrilla or the roof gardening was one of the experiments that now actually hosts one of the most marvelous lunch rooms that is doing very well on top, called the Dakakker. Then on the other side of the building, they initiated a bit more activating the public life, because this is considered, it was a parking lot and partially still is, but considered really the backdrop, with the beer garden. And the beer garden obviously is not much more or less what it is, but just for an architect to initiate it, I think this is different than the other way around. Usually, well, I won't go. I have 7 projects, so I have to be fast. I can't go into all details, but what they added, as I showed here, it's pretty difficult to get from one side to the other, because it's very much, Rotterdam is a city built on mobility. So what they added was in fact extra public space. And this was fully crowdfunded. This whole bridge was crowdfunded, that you could buy one part of the bridge and have your name laser cut into it. And if you look here, you see the names. And then actually they made the bridge. As you can tell, this is not a rendering. This is a real life connector that is now, this was the ambition, connect a whole new layer, a sort of floating layer. This is a rendering throughout the city of Rotterdam. Just one slide to finish off. They've connected to another old industrial zone. This used to shelter or house a train connection to The Hague, which is north of here. And they made a beautiful presentation in the form of a theater, in collaboration with the theater program, questioning public life and our democracy on a vacant lot. So just a way to show that there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of programmatic connectivity in order to revitalize this area that is now very vital, and it looks marvelous as such. Okay, another one, a more recent project and on a larger scale and for a very long period. The Bijlmer, I do not know to what extent you are in the know of the Dutch history, but it was the honeycomb flat that was built after Second World War to house, truly in a modernist sense, a lot of people in a very dense area, and then have a lot of green, light, fresh air around it. Throughout the history, this became fairly unpopular, and then it became popular with our Suriname Dutch people. And then there was a lot of tension in this neighborhood, which made for it to be in decline. They tried to look into how can we deal with these kind of large scale structures, and they decided, the developer decided that they could not invest in actually relifting this monument. So what they did is symbolically sell it for €1, and the architects NL and XVM, they actually provided a structure for owners to take care of the interior. So the architects did the exterior. I think I have, yeah, this is sort of the essence of the project is in these slides. They redesigned the entry on all levels, and they brought the whole building back to its core. So they just cleaned the whole building again, and then the old beautiful concrete came out. What happens is when a building gets into decline, usually they start painting it. So then you have all these layers of paint and it becomes just gruesome. And I think it's very nice that they radically brought it back to its essence. Here you see an illustrative picture of somebody working in the interior. And there's all these different questions coming up, of course, like how long can, talking about noise pollution or how to build a community. There's a lot of work being done, but it's finished now, and they won several prizes, or it was finished 2 years ago, for actually how they opened up this whole building. So this is, for instance, you're looking at the former, this part was in fact, so the plinth was closed, it was a storage space, and they opened it up, just making it more lively. And now it looks, well, very fresh and beautiful. Another more conceptual work is by Space and Matter. And I'll talk about the actors a little bit in a minute, but here I try to sort of illustrate who are the actors. We have, of course, the market, the municipality, the architect, and the citizen. So I've tried to mark who was on board and who was not, because it's more and more, of course, the market that drives the question of city making than speculation. This is a very charming project where it's based and situated in the city of Amsterdam. And as you know, we are a country on the water side and have been battling with water all for centuries. But more and more what you see is that that's been technologically absorbed. So the whole, let's say, infrastructure of the water has been organized as a whole in the city of Amsterdam, also in Rotterdam, but that's beside the point. In this project, these little houses that used to shelter the person that would open the bridge and close the bridge became obsolete. So in all of Amsterdam, there are 28 of these little beautiful jewels, architectural jewels, that were just standing there empty. And I think it's a very lovely concept by Space and Matter that they said, hey, we can use this, let's animate these places and make them into hotel rooms. So that's what they did. So it's the biggest distributed hotel there is. So this is the interior of the one I just showed you, because I will choose the one that looks most like Rietveld. Because of the Rietveld Pavilion. So this is again much more a strategic insight, and then the architect has a modest role in organizing the whole thing, finding a party who wants to go on board, and they're doing very well. Another way to give an impulse to a region is by creating temporal, let's say what I call programmatic architecture with a sort of acupuncture asset to it. Bureau Sla and Overtreders W. They came up with this, wanting to investigate and experiment, because this is also something that I'm very concerned with. Where do we experiment with architecture? Where is the space for playing around in order to see where we can bring the discipline further? And they used, in this case, a lot of material to build a beautiful pavilion called the People's Pavilion in and during an invitation of the Dutch Design Week, where they created a gathering space. Now the shingles you see, they are recycled plastics shingles. So I think it's one of the first times that we see recycled aesthetic that actually looks beautiful. I speak for myself there. This whole building was made without a single screw, and really is instantly made there. And the reason I think it still fits in the chapter of heritage is that it's the surrounding that is the heritage. This is the Philips, the former Philips laboratory and factory that is currently being transformed into a live and work environment called Strijp S in Eindhoven. So again, here in interior, you see how everything is tied together instead of constructively screwed together. I'm going through it very fast, but here's the latest, I think, addition or pearl, we could say, when it comes to how to deal with heritage and reinvent it. An old locomotive factory, that's why it's called Lokhal. Hal is the Dutch word for, let's say, like a hangar. This is what it used to look like in its interior. And here it was the municipality that wanted to activate and connect two neighborhoods and used this building to enter several programmatic realities. So there's there's the library. There was a necessity to house people. There is, so it's an auditorium. You can have lunch, of course. There's a lot of potentiality. And with these curtains, there's the room divider that actually still gives it a very intimate atmosphere. It's interesting because it's quite huge. When I arrived there to look at the building, the curtain was moving by itself or by an algorithmic program, which was very interesting. But I do not know if that's still going on. As I mentioned, the municipality, so this is where the Lokhal is. You can tell it's a seriously large building. And this is considered downtown Tilburg, where this building is situated. And the connector is the central station, also to revitalize this whole neighborhood and connect them, because usually highways and the infrastructure, of course, are big barriers in order for connections within the city fabric. Now, an older but still a very beautiful one, and this is where we, let's say, go towards the market, or the classic way of understanding revitalization of heritage is, in fact, how to deal with churches, and then we bring program into it. This is a church in Maastricht, in the south of the Netherlands, where they made a beautiful bookstore. I think I know it won several prizes, but it also really became this place for bringing people together. And of course, the tongue-in-cheek table still references the identity of the building, but it is no longer in use as a church, and just doesn't stand there as a ghost, but is a very active heart now. I'm showing this because this is, let's say, the most conventional way of how to deal with activating architecture. One recent one, and one that I took out because it's in the Westergasfabriek. It's a temporary fair, and I thought it's a very interesting way to show you that with a very light sense of material, in this case, a collage city was made in order to house, I believe, 63 artists in a temporal art fair. And this is then again a place where architectural experimentation, namely the scenography of the space, can come together. What they did is they took 5 different floor plans and radically merged them into the spatial composition that you see here. It is there for a month. It's light. It's again, I want to make this point of different temporal realities, and this is then activating again, of course, that whole neighborhood. So that's from the scale of the architect. From the scale of the social community, there's a very interesting example here in Rotterdam called City in the Making, where a group of active citizens, an architecture firm and an architecture historian are working to see if we can come up with an alternative way to organize the political and financial mechanisms in the city in order to see if we can find new ways of commoning. They have received by their, let's call it the project developer, but the corporation, sorry, the corporation has given them several properties for 10 years. So it's a very clear deal. You have them for 10 years in order to develop alternative strategies in looking at how architecture and community can reconnect to each other. In this case, they, I had a hard time finding all the different programmatic impulses that they have done. But for instance, the whole concept is that they would provide working space, but also always doing something for the community in the street. So I just want to point out, here you see several washing machines, and this is an open washing machine for the whole street. And then one of the designers, Guillaume Sille, artist designer, he has worked on an ecological washing powder. So you see all these sort of strange cross sections that start to emerge. And this is a little bit the sketch by artist Melle Smets, who tries to combine what is necessary in a neighborhood. So they have a library, they have a cinema that hosts about I think 30 people with always very lovely introductions. Well, you can't see now, but behind the lineup of Zoom, you see a newspaper that they worked on. There's a space where you can actually make things yourself, so like a woodworking place. They've also initiated Panchol Almonde for the, let's say, city nomad. People entering the city obviously always have a hard time finding a place where they can stay, even for 2-3 weeks, in order for them to understand the city. And this is what they want to shelter and provide, in order again to reconnect the common and the community to the city, giving people a chance. And just to give you a short oversight, it's a place for experimentation when it comes to cultural production in the broadest sense of the word. There's radio making going on. There's a kitchen that cooks for people. There's proper community building, a place where young talented designers can experiment to find their signature, in this case Studio Care. Exhibitions can be hosted, new communities can find each other. They're actively programmed to bring people together around sewing, around cooking, and everybody knows that it's for 10 years, so there's no let's say, well, obviously disappointment is a very difficult word to deal with, but that as long as it's clear up front what we're dealing with, then you can handle maybe this idea that things are for a temporal reality. The last one I want to show is a project that I've personally been involved in with many others, because it's important to stress that these initiatives never come alone. So another important shift is let's say the architect as an ego towards maybe again a more holistic understanding of what it takes to take responsibility and connect and collaborate. The park was a residue of again an end of an industry, in this case in Maastricht, the ceramics industry. And what happened is that this is the factory, and then these were the places where there was storage and the drawing on the ceramics. So it was basically demolished when the factory closed. I always find this a very marvelous image, because you see at that time they had 4,000 workers working in that area, and a lot of, interestingly enough, also a lot of women were working in these factories. This is taken about around 1910. This was the projection of what would happen, a little bit a combination of working, leisure, and dwelling. Due to the Lehman crisis, this didn't go through. So this is how we actually found it as a cultural institute. And this is an exhibition that I worked on little after, or exhibition program, a little after the Vacant NL, when on invitation of Guus Beumer, the then director of the museum, asked me to reflect on what would vacancy mean through the lens of the landscape, because we also always think about buildings, but what does it mean for the landscape? So in this case, it is when the industry is removed, literally, what comes back is the land, how to deal with the land. And we wanted, again, this was also the period where our king just said we are do democracy. So if it's a do democracy, what can we do together? So there was an open call, and we asked, can we open up this, this space to the public again? Can we have it as a testing site to investigate what would people want if they get the question? You can participate, you can do whatever. What happens? So with help of an ecological gardener, this pattern was made, very lightly drawn into the fabric. An atrium was made, and a very small shelter by Maurer United Architects, which you see in a bit in the center left. A local squatting community asked if they could, in fact, get a part of the garden in order to start gardening. And what we would do, to give you an idea, was invest in the soil and the seeds, and we would ask them to return a favor to contribute to the public good. So do something for the community. So we would invest in one, but try to open it up. And in their case, they then created what we call a neighborhood barbecue. So people would meet that would usually not meet. And also special to this program, I think, was that different generations met around, like older people still had memory on how to garden, in fact. So it's about also these different kind of knowledges that we can give through the generation. But also, two young gentlemen wanted to start a gallery, and they got a spot, and they literally created the smallest gallery in Maastricht. Also very temporal things, for instance, a one-day poetry festival where people would walk a parcours and people would read from their work. One, I think this is the before last one, we, when I say we, it's two cultural institutes, Mares and Bureau Europa, invested and collaborated with Bee Collective, which is again a group of architects and designers who wanted to give an impulse to the bee keeping in the inner city. Because of the monoculture of our landscapes, bees are, well, in a derelict state, and we of course need them to start the whole food production. So here you have a pole that holds bees, because that is always the tension between people and bees. So this is very high, and they would come down, and I believe 10 urban beekeepers were educated, and we actually had our own honey from the park. And then later we helped upset a crowdfunding action, because this became extremely heavy, would get up to 45 kilos, and we were, I don't know the English word, but it's like going up and down with like a sail mast. So you can imagine if it's 45 kilos, that the idea to have it on solar panels going up and down was received and welcomed. Last one was a very beautiful project called Picnic Electronique. Two young gentlemen with a very nice network asked if they could use the park to give like a Woodstock-esque party atmosphere. And it was the first time, so we're just 2 turntables, and people would bring their drinks. I believe we did 4 in total. And then the last one, we nearly had 2,500 people there. We had to have security, we had to have toilets, there was informal economies going on, people selling beer. So all of a sudden it became, what was just an experiment to see what happens if you just give people space, that it in fact became a huge success and drew people in and really animated everything. Again, it was very temporal, because this is the reality now. This is what the park looks like. It became a parking lot. And they're going to build houses, or they're actually start building houses on this end. So we knew that it was temporal. And that is, I think, a very important part, and I'm nearly making my closing remarks, that when we talk about time and we talk about value and we talk about who is going to invest which kind of energy, it is good to understand these forces. Forces about commitment. Some people they want to commit maybe for a week. Others can have the will to commit 8 years. But to engage in this kind of project usually requires from either the active citizen or the architect long-term engagement. So you need stamina and really keep on going. Another thing I think is very important, besides this idea of how do you deal with time, is how do you deal with the fact that you might be capitalized on, that the energy you and your community put into these buildings or into these neighborhoods by bringing creative ideas and a lot of energy and commitment are also the fuel for gentrification. And gentrification, well, I think we are all architects who are listening now, but in a very short and a bit of an ugly little diagram, can be understood, of course, in different agents. So I said what was on the periphery is now in the center, and that with that I meant architects with a particular design attitude were at the periphery of the discourse in 2010, but now due to the crises, multiples, ecological, social, economical, their way of thinking is entering the center of the discipline. But these drivers of gentrification and how to in fact capitalize ourselves on the drivers of gentrification is a very, very interesting question I think we need to address and we need to understand. So as I said, there's the land, and which value creation is putting on top of the land? What are the agents for the gentrification? Who are the gentrifiers? I think we know all the negative connotations with the hipsters, people, artists that go to neighborhoods that were initially then have a low rent or even for free, but then they become popular, then there's a cash flow going to these neighborhoods, and then the people that actually made the neighborhood so nice and so lively can't afford it anymore, and they're pushed further out and further out. So here's where my remark on policy comes back in. The only way to deal with this is, of course, policy, where architecture and policy come together. Or we have to acknowledge that we say, no, this is, let's say, an attitude of nomadic, let's say, fluidity, that we will change every now and then. We will go to a new neighborhood. But maybe we have that capacity, but people that are more precarious in their livelihood or dependent on their low rent, of course, suffer greatly. And it's been also studied quite a bit that people from minority backgrounds are suffering more from this constant machine called gentrification and speculation. And that brings me to the other part. My biggest question for the next period of time is the nature of our economy is changing. So it was illustrated in the Vacant NL, the change from industry to, let's say, knowledge economy, then from knowledge economy to, let's say, creative economy. But more and more our economy is becoming gasified, you could say. It's becoming air. It's becoming the promises that we make. If we see that the global stock market gained 17 trillion in value. What does that say? Of course, we see global shifts. China is rising, India is rising, the US is on the decline. I think there's a great future there also for the Eastern European countries, but it's not in my knowledge to activate that question. But the question is how to deal with the huge discrepancy between speculation and money that is looking for gravity, because this money wants to go somewhere, and usually architecture is the vehicle to get this money, give this money some literally some weight. So this gentrification on the one hand, and all the good intentions and programmatic architecture that's going around there, and then the speculation and big global financial systems on the other hand. How do we correlate these two realities? That is, I think, a very huge challenge we have ahead. Also, when we think about, for instance, which materials do we use then for our architecture? I think you're all very well in the know that cement is, of course, highly polluted and CO2 producing while making it and using it. So then some points on the horizon that I think we need to address when we work with these methods, because I see it more as a method. So how does the tradition and the new, by which I mean technology, how technology is of course also a device in which we can organize ourselves. The technology and the new, both culturally, in technology, cycles and time. Is it what is linear? What is circular? Reevaluating value. Which values do we want to safeguard that that we do not start producing sameness all over the planet? So it's about certain kind of tradition maybe, or really trying to fight for particular common values. So this is the new collectivism that I talk about, and reactivating landscapes. So I mean not only the urban fabric, but try to play the game on multiple boards at the same time. New structures for collaboration, financial structures, energy and social empowerment. And a lot of questions are asked about how, and here are some of the, let's say, hints that I think it is not about totally leaving behind the old world, but it is about enveloping a design attitude in a new world. And this new world is maybe more about the context than the object. It's more about sharing than it's about ownership. Well, we could debate endlessly if and how and in which context, which strategy would work best, in fact, to activate our cities. So with this rather maybe boring line, I come to the last point. I think it's very important for us to keep on searching for the voices we have. It's very easy to become a bit desperate when macro capital comes into neighborhoods, or a lack of potence of politicians is becoming so self-evident and transparent. And what we need is to organize and to voice ourselves. And I thought I'd end with something that I would look forward to if I am from your region, namely a swan song, a week of art interventions, poetry, performance, with the aim to find that voice and to give voice to people that are voiceless. So that's, I thought it would be charming to finish off with something from your context that you maybe did not know about. I'll keep it at that. And if there are any questions, I'll put back the first slide because it's so nice and light blue. I am absolutely open for questions in case anybody has them. I hope it was a bit what you expected, a bit longer than half an hour, but.
I would like to welcome all people that attend the lecture to ask questions. I have asked to unmute yourself, so the scene is yours if you want to give
Hello.
your first impressions. And
Hi. My name is Elena, and I was interested to ask something about the Venice installation. What was some of the feedback that you got on that project from, because you have such wide international base of visitors on that? What were some of the more interesting things you heard as feedback?
Well, so let's say I'll go to the slide where it is about the newspapers. If we just take the news media as a reference point, sorry, I hope I don't make you dizzy. In fact, it really sparked off a lot of positive feedback loops to, let's say, as a mirror of our time, and also that it was made productive in order to give a perspective on how we could deal with these, because all the project I showed, or most of the project I showed, were from after we put this on the agenda. And maybe, again, in other cultural or economical contexts, maybe the reuse of buildings is much more normal. But in our case, in that particular time, it was more about preservation and not about activation. And we try to use the biennial in order to catalyze the discourse on why are these buildings just locked up and not used. I think in that sense, because it was such a visual one-liner, if I may be self-critical, or it was in fact a very well decided choice to make it so clear in what it wanted to communicate, and then have all the layers underneath. But the first impact, of course, is it's very selfie given. It's aesthetic, but we took us 1 year of getting together on every Monday. Barbara Visser opened up her working space for us to meet on a regular basis to communicate, like, what is the essence of this question? And I think people really appreciated the attempt to use the biennial to show a different Dutch reality, but also, of course, to talk back to the context, the cultural context, the political context back home. So there was not so much critique going on. But I would welcome it if you have, Elena, but I can only say that it was very well received. Because it was pushing forward an urgency.
Yes, thank you. I don't have any critique on that. I just I just see exactly how this can translate, or it can spark some ideas in the minds of people from all different cities and all different countries.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, what is your opinion about meanwhile uses, like pop-up shops and galleries?
Yeah.
Well, do you think that because they are more affordable, do you think that they also lead to gentrification, or there is something more soft, like measure?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically you're asking, are they part of the problem or are they part of the solution?
Yes,
And I think that's the essence of the question I tried to pose at the end. So where do we situate a good intention or a good initiative in this force field of capital accumulation? And I think it is something that that only the municipality has the power, or a government has the power, to come up with smart legislation that we can make sure that either the architecture that is coming in has a particular quality, or that the small fine-grained people that initiate, put a lot of energy in these neighborhoods, that they can stay when the market prices start to rise. And I think this is something that it's been tried, but there's not so many successful attempts. What you see is testing in the Dutch context now, testing, for instance, with different kind of financial models. So as a gallery, if you're a startup, you can, for instance, have a lease of 5 years. And then in the first year, you only pay 30% of the whole sum. That would give you the time to invest, to build up a reputation. And then throughout time, you work towards being able to pay the 100%. I think that's a very interesting strategy in order to provide the fertile ground for young startups. On the other hand, that's of course, that's the start of the whole thing. But how then, if a neighborhood becomes popular, can you manage it to stay, to keep that quality while not pressing out these younger initiatives? And I think that's where legislation and I'm reminded of a very interesting proposition that we had in the exhibition was by Stealth Unlimited. They made like a legislation, a 10-point manifesto on how to deal with these bigger forces in relationship to financial capital that is looking for accumulation and looking for gravity. But it is a riddle, and that's why I said we should not become maybe too depressed or too negative. We just have to maybe start with these initiatives, but with the full awareness that the chance is very high that somebody else will capitalize on your energy or investment or community building. But that's, I don't want to sound cynical, but it is the perfect formula has not been found yet. And only, I think, legislation and politics can solve that.
And do you think that the urban planning model in the Netherlands is neoliberal? I mean that in our country, builders are very concerned about their economical interests, and if it's not the municipality to regulate the zones to be art zones, it won't be initiated by citizen owners and so on. It's my personal feeling. I don't want to generalize, but in general, it's always, in most cases, it's a decision made by municipalities. Maybe we are still in municipalities how to decide the zone, and on the one side, on the other side, it's the private owners' interests, economical interests, and private and public interests, they're in a strong conflict. I mean, there is no.
Yeah, that's. I think you really you hit the nail on the head there with your remark. But I mean, we're both people, private investors and the public. The underlying problem or question is that we have to address how can we fund our public sphere. How do we? I mean, how does a city pay for being a city? How do we? We pay for it with taxes, but there's a huge pressure on the viability of our local municipalities and our governments to keep our cities alive financially. So who is bearing the finance of the civic reality? And what you see more and more often is, of course, that investors from outside they come in with a huge sack of money, with a promise of jobs, with a promise, there's all these promises that then municipalities, they can't do anything else than be happy with this cash flowing into their cities or into their regions. But I believe that with good policy making and with good collaboration between the market and municipality, you can indeed create different value propositions that have to be met. In the Dutch context, things are changing from well, a little bit, but there is a conversation starting about neoliberalism and that the end of neoliberalism, or that the system that we have put in place now is just too, it has no future. But there are no new models in how this can come together in a more productive way. And it's not so much that, I think a big problem is also this anonymity. So anonymity, when you say the investors, they don't care, it's because if a broker in London is selling, I don't know, one street in Sofia, the people that are buying and investing, it's such a huge distance to envision that there's people involved there. It just becomes the mechanism behind the market. I think that this distance and proximity and seeing that these are all people that we're dealing with needs to become more apparent in the surface, but more, again, back to my initial point, for me, the only tool I see is active citizenship, a strong leadership when it comes to the municipalities, in order to not become so dependent of the money that the investors are bringing in. So how do you do that? How do you create mutual desirability? Because an investor, of course, for an investor, a good atmosphere in a neighbor is also important. People will stay longer, the value will create. But these conversations are hard to, are not being met. But I mean, for me personally, I think we are on the verge of a total new systemic change, that we really need to rethink the systems on which we have built our society, in the Dutch context in particular. But if I think, for instance, about the pharma complex, when we talk about the pharma complex, the biggest problem is, of course, that we profit if people are ill. If you would make the profit that nobody gets ill, it's a different organizational principle. So I hope you understand what I'm saying, is that we should shift the outcome of these questions to make it a collaborative concern, because that's the only way forward, unfortunately. And we have to move fast because the world is on fire. I seriously believe that the questions, I mean, of course, it makes us all very sad when we read that Bezos, I think I had it here, that said the capital accumulation with some, and it's stuck. The capital accumulation with some in relation to the misery of all the others, it is it's a huge tension. If I read that he has the most wealthy man there, and then the employees of Amazon, they all have post-traumatic stress syndrome from just working in a distribution center. I mean, this is not, we're then not going on the right way. Now, I'm taking a long time to find the slide, I'm sorry, but. So it's about this redistribution of wealth, but also redistribution of knowledge, and systemic changes that need to be made. But I'm not saying that alone, obviously. If you're interested in these, let's say, macro combinations, then on BAK, B-A-K, in Utrecht, there's a beautiful lecture by David Harvey, where he makes this relationship between global capital and what that actually means on the ground and for architecture and for then the ecological crises and social crises that we are now dealing with.
And anyone else who would like to ask a question?
I'd like to ask a question.
Hey, Cynthia.
Hi, Saskia.
That's so nice of you to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for your fantastic lecture. And I wondered if you could comment on this urban centricity, that everything is urban centric. It's been urban centric for, I mean, you've been hearing it all the time about how cities are the place to be. That's where everybody's going. And yet, what's happened to rurality? Can we, when we're talking about redistribution, can we start to rethink a balance between these very heavy concrete, saturated points that have emptied out this the space of the rural and the idea of the rural? Can we start thinking about this redistribution again as maybe helping to reformulate the way we are with our land and each other and expertises? Do you think it's possible?
Well, I think we have to. Let me start by saying by that. I mean, I'm assuming everybody knows the figures. 2050, the projection is that 75% of population worldwide will be centered in urban realities. This is what Cynthia is hinting on, and of course this draw to the countryside has many reasons, but basically, of course, people are looking for an economical viable future for themselves. So when we talk about the reasons why people migrate, is obviously not because there's work or because there's food, or they are searching for places to, in fact, get a life again. And I mean, I was not going to mention COVID, and I was not going to mention OMA, but here we have them. It is not without coincidence, of course, that OMA is looking and revisiting the countryside as a potentiality, not only through the lens of the production of food, but actually reimagining the countryside, which is then no longer called the landscape, but the countryside again. The countryside as a place to meet the sublime, to reconnect to the body, to reconnect to ourselves, to an environment. Yet how to organize that, I find extremely challenging. I mean, there's theory going around in trying to create decentralized models, like buffer around large cities, smaller new towns, in order to get the stress out a little bit. What I was thinking about last week, I was talking to a friend who was in housing, renting housing, and he was mentioning that that in fact, due to COVID, the housing market is changing. So where we had the tendency to go smaller, and now we are stuck in our interiors, people are looking for more and more space, literally, because, well, I live alone, but I know of many of my friends that have wife, husband, and or children, that they need space to keep sane because they don't move to office spaces anymore. So what if this pandemic is here to stay for another 5 years? This will obviously influence the way we perceive space, the way we need space. And the people that can afford it now are actually moving out of the cities. And I think if I project onto, I was talking about how our economy is changing. We're moving to an economy that is based on reputation. I mean, what is an economy based on reputation? That is so ephemeral. You can be wherever you are because you are a node in the network. So that's why I feel that we are in such a challenging time, is to understand and to revision re-envision what are the questions that are underpinning the question that Cynthia has put forward. How do we make it attractive again? Or is it already attractive but we can't afford it? Or there's a lot of interesting models. I just this morning have interviewed Arjen Oosterman. He's the editor-in-chief of Volume, and he lives in Almere in Oostwolde, where MVRDV and a politician called Adrie Duivenstein have tried to truly test what does it do with people if you give them space. And here you have one of the most renowned architectural historians who had to admit to himself and so to me to say, I couldn't even have imagined what I'm learning, what I'm doing, how I'm evolving. He's gardening, he's into all these literally systemic, but then on the level of materiality. So water and wood. And so this is just an example to say that we also have to nearly maybe open up to ourselves. What would that mean? And in fact, your practice, I think, Cynthia, is one of these examples of people that have the daring, the dare and the rigor to delve into these questions and see where the tacit knowledge is, where the reconnection to nature is. And I sometimes wonder, like, who is benefiting from us being so consumerist?
Mm-hmm.
Even on the left side of the periphery, we would have to activate the whole discourse again on how to envision a fulfilling life and what does community mean in that. And so, long story short, I think with how the current trend on technological and economical trends are going, that those who have the daring capacity and will make the first jump will move out of the cities, in fact, and self-organize in smaller communities. But your question actually is a whole lecture in itself. But as you know, I'm very interested in the landscape and how we finance our landscape. And by that, I mean, I'm talking back to maybe an exhibition that I made on the shift in the Dutch subsidy system. So in the European Union, the subsidy system is changing as we speak. In 2015, it was implemented. In 2020, this year, it sort of is rounded off, where it's not so much about productivity anymore, but again, a layered notion and understanding of care. What does it mean? How do we want to care for our landscape? And I think, for instance, one of the challenges the Dutch agricultural scene is facing is degrowth and decentralization. And with degrowth, I literally mean well, let's say, why do I'm not so much against stacking cattle, but that's another whole different ballgame. But to rethink how we organize our agricultural stock, but also degrowth in terms of why should one of the smallest country in the world be the second largest exporting body of food? Whereas what would happen if we start to decentralize the knowledge we have? And here again, we're talking about two different models. A model that is rooted in, well, I would say the 19th century way of thinking about agriculture, and what would be the 21st century way. Is that what would happen if the Dutch would start, and it is happening with little incidents, but if we start not thinking about distribution of the cows and pigs and milk and butter, but actually relocalize farms in where have you.
Mm-hmm.
But we could, yeah, I do not know what the exact drivers will be, but I think a serious pandemic helps. If the question is if it will stick around long enough for us to really start making systemic changes, and with which pace, or how fast we will decide to go back to the model we had before, or we know is obsolete. I think most people are acknowledging that at this point. I'm going to get rid of this grim image. Anybody else who wants to?
Yeah, a question from me, Todor.
Hey,
Speaking
Todor.
about funding, have you witnessed crowdfunding campaigns for some of these projects that you mentioned? And also, are there any pre-commercial procurements by municipalities? I know that European Commission in Netherlands are pretty enthusiastic about pre-commercial procurement in innovation projects related to construction of normal infrastructure like protection from the sea and so on and so forth, but there's little bit of similar tools for cultural projects, and I'm exploring the opportunities that Bulgaria can use the pre-commercial procurement for innovative projects using IT for protecting cultural heritage and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in those two, crowdfunding and pre-commercial procurement.
Yeah. There's actually, I don't have that slide in here, but I think this coupling of IT, as I mentioned it already, as an organizational tool, is of course a very interesting way to go. I would say that nearly all the projects I've shown have, in one way or the other, been supported by a crowd. They received awards, or they literally, as I showed, for instance, the project of Zeus, that they crowdfunded the bridge, or adding to the public infrastructure of the city of Rotterdam. When it comes, because your question has many scales, right? When it comes to this, I'm also intrigued by, why do people in fact contribute to these crowdfunding? So why do people play along? What is in it? What are they projecting onto a particular project for them to anticipate? Or what is the, so for instance, would you know who would want to hook onto your proposition? Is it something that is communally carried? Theodore?
It's just kind of an idea. I don't expect any particular project in mind, but I mean, generally people participate in crowdfunding in two ways. One is just donation for a public good, which happens all the time. And then the second one is kind of buying or ordering a service in advance. For instance, I might want to buy a ticket for a very interesting show next summer in an archaeological site with augmented reality and so on and so forth, because I know that on the spot, like next year, there will be no tickets, or the price will go up and so on and so forth. So by participating in a crowdfunding campaign, I expect to kind of reserve my ticket, and I take the risk that if the product is not ready, I mean, it's okay. I can wait, or I can just forget about my money and so on and so forth. So this about motivation of people. Probably it's very similar to the way theaters, operas, ballets, and so on and so forth organize societies of friends. The various societies that pay membership fees and get service, and these societies use this money to kind of build around either infrastructure or pay particular activities. So I expect that it could be working model in the area.
Yeah.
As for the pre-commercial procurement, I'm interested also from a kind of legal perspective, because so far the examples that I know are for public, either very large public infrastructure projects and technology innovation project. I mean, something that you need a lot of R&D to do. So usually in cultural projects, you don't expect R&D.
Yeah. Yeah.
And usually the framework for the pre-commercial procurements are related to R&D projects. So I'm curious if it's a case where a municipality used this tool to provide some competition. And by the way, in brackets, I don't agree with this anti-liberal kind of point of view. It's kind of too simplistic, I think. So all the market failures that we observe, it's not because of the liberal model, but because of failure of the state to fulfill its duties.
Yeah.
So
no, but that's why I said the
narrative. I would. Yeah, but it's a total different story and lecture and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
So
no,
I hope this clarifies my motivation to ask.
Yeah. No, it does. It's also nice to get an understanding of your let's say cultural reality. Maybe to just set the record straight. I mean, for me, the neoliberal, there's a lot of critiques I have. For one, the extraction on the earth, the huge inequality that it propels, the sameness that it produces. But I do believe that it's, and that's also I think something that I was trying to voice, is that we need to find new collaborative models between the market and, in this case, for instance, the governing body. So in that sense, we are on the same page. But how to do so, and talking back to your question, is of course at this point, I mean, I only know people that are on the more, let's say, speculative design side of things. We see a lot of people trying to indeed create a sort of communality through the internet. I'm thinking of an office called OS City, based in Eindhoven, where they are literally looking into create critical mass, and I think that's the potential of the crowdfunding, that it creates a certain critical mass. However, once that capital is accumulated for a certain project, you have all these sets of expectations, and who wants to contribute with what. Some people have time to invest, some others. In the case that you mentioned, for instance, you invest here, but you expect an opera there. So there's different temporal realities, and there's different, let's say, roles and ethical positions to be played out. And I think this idea of the critical mass and the decentralized decision patterns or processes have a huge potential, but at this point are under investigated, I would say, or underused, at least in our context. But maybe what you do see, for instance, is I'm now thinking of the powerhouse company firm, where they start to reclaim the whole chain of the marginalized position that the architect is in the Dutch context at the moment. I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's, let's say, the general feeling we have, that the market is dominating the whole discourse, and because of a lack of a powerful government on whatever scale we want to talk about governance, that they feel that they have to reinvent themselves, and the most inspiring models are now, let's say, open building systems, or where the architect is actually also the developer, also the builder, and the architect at the same time. So they've organized their whole process, whereas, let's say, we have come to a point where the architect only came in to put on a facade of things. But I would have to dive in deeper to your question in order to answer it more profoundly in the potential. But I would say that expectation on the side of the one who is contributing. So what do they expect as a return on their investment, and how this capital accumulation can in fact play a role in taking certain risks in the future. And in these risks, I mean finding new ways to collaborate, finding new processes to organize either cultural or architectural production.
Anyone else who would like to ask a question? Maybe it's about to come to an end. If you want to, if you are ready.
Well, I would gladly, I don't know when this is going to air, but I would gladly, I don't know, have a second session, and then I can look into Tidor's question and respond to him. If not, I'm always here for further questions or dialogue. I really appreciate also getting an insight what these mechanisms mean for your context, as I tried to voice in the beginning that I obviously very clearly speak from the Dutch perspective. And even though the mechanisms are global, the way they play out are have local components.
I would like to thank you for your very impressive lecture, and for all of us who managed to attend and to participate in our discussion. It was a very nice experience for me.
Thank you for the invitation, and well, hope to see you somewhere in Bulgaria within now and the near future, after COVID is yeah.
Or near, or very soon, Zoom
or
maybe.
via Zoom.
Okay.
Okay, thank you once more, and have a nice weekend to all. And again, I'm here in the case that people want to add comments also on an informal level. Feel free to reach out. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
You.
Ciao.
It's inspiring.
Bye. Bye.